Um, Man, I missed you all. I've been gone for a few weeks, and it feels very good to be back. And to be back on this day, what a great day to celebrate C3 and all the many gifts that this community has and offers to one another in this auction. So thank you. Um, and yeah, I had a little family vacation, which was great. I was down south, and I was also out west. I went out to Colorado for a training, and I drove 26 hours, one way, of course. It's awesome on the way there. I mean, you forget America is big. It is huge, and to see the Rockies emerge when you're still an hour away from them it's sort of, I maybe cried a little bit. I was also listening to Pearl Jam, so that helped. And, I had an amazing trip. And one of the things that happens, I do these from time to time. This particular one was a training, and what happens is that I'm out of cell phone range, which is still possible in America, believe it or not. And so you're sort of out of touch with the news, and I don't know why I did the quotation marks. I was out of touch with the news. So coming back sort of into contact can be a bit disarming. And it happens almost every time. And sometimes I feel a little superior, like, oh, I was just in the real world of nature, and now I'm back to this paper-thin materialism. But I didn't have that feeling upon returning, because I turned on the news, and it was just starting to, the stories were just starting to be told about what was happening on the border. That was the first thing I heard upon sort of re-entry. And, I could feel it, like I felt it in my chest, and it hurt. And I felt a little touch of grief, and I wondered, what is happening? What is happening? And not just in this particular case, which seems so inhumane, just taking children away from parents. Like in the little children's message, like, what would you do if there was a new person? Oh, I know, take them away from their parents. It just seems so inhumane. But it also seems to be a kind of symbol for a lot of shadow stuff in our culture. Did you see the cover of Time magazine? Donald Trump standing there with that crying kid. That's what I mean by a symbol. It's looking us in the face. This little kid is crying in front of us and pointing out our ambiguities. Like Bob's meditation was so rich with the tensions of modern life. Like Rilke says, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. And they sit side by side, and they work on us. And they cause us to ask questions about what kind of world are we living in? Not much, and what kind of world do we want to live in? Meanwhile, it's easy to tune out. It's called the World Cup. Right now, England is playing. I'm thinking, what's the score right now? And I like the World Cup. I mean, I'm just going to be honest about that. But that's what modern life is like. There's so much moral and ethical ambiguity and tension. There's so much beauty and so much terror at the same time. And so anyway, coming back from Colorado, I found all of this disturbing. And part of me wondered, there seems to be a kind of split, maybe in our collective unconscious, a kind of separation. And maybe one way of saying that is there's a split between who we say we are and how we actually live. There's a split between the stories we tell ourselves, like an American is, and then actually how we behave and the way our laws function. And it's very hard to look at that split. It's almost better to keep it at arm's length, like we want to keep kids away from the border and parents away. We don't want to look at our own ambiguities, like a country of immigrants turns around and oppresses immigrants. That's a hard thing to look at. It's a hard thing to look at. No one wants to do that kind of internal housekeeping. And let's not just blame Trump. This is the way governments are. I remember when Obama won the Peace Prize, and I was a fan of Obama. I read his memoir, Dreams of My Father, or one of those, Dreams Father. And I was like, man, this person, what a compelling story. Yet, filled with all kinds of ironies, like winning the Nobel Peace Prize and also dropping more bombs from drones than any president, and sometimes killing people at a wedding party in Pakistan. That's a hard thing to look at. And I don't know what I would do if I was president. I don't know what I would do. But anyway, it's hard to do that kind of internal housekeeping. What is it really like to be an American, and how have we treated people? I heard people saying this is so un-American that we would take kids away from their parents. This is not what it means to be an American, except that's what we've always done. We took black families from Africa and separated them and sold them. And that wasn't all that long ago. We took Native American kids away from their parents so that they wouldn't learn the language. I don't know why, Where's the emotion come from? In part, it comes from just being a parent. And it's so much easier for me to say, well, I didn't do that. Which then keeps it at arm's length. Like thinking about Obama. I didn't drop drones on people, except my taxes did. And even if it's like homeopathy, where it's like very, 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 very tiny amount of my money, it's still there. And same with what's happening at the border. It's we bear some responsibility. Yeah. A friend of mine on Instagram had a little post this week about her own mother being put in a Japanese internment camp. That's not what we do as Americans, except it is sometimes. It's not all we do, which leads us to the kind of moral ambiguity that I'm talking about, and tension. So there's a split between who we say we are and the story we tell ourselves, bring me your huddled masses, and then how we live. And I guess the invitation of the 21st century is to wake up to this. And we are waking up. I mean, I like Richard Rohr. He says, wherever you get, he's talking about religion, but I suppose it applies to politics. Wherever you get the very best, you get the very worst. So a lot of really amazing and wonderful and beautiful and humane things have happened in the name of our country, and also lots of inhumane things. So that's what I'm saying. What's the 21st century going to hold for us? Some of it is we have to turn toward this stuff. And it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. And we have to look at our own inconsistencies. And one of the things that particularly bothered me was the use of the Bible in this. I don't know if that bugged you at all. I'm imagining it bugged you. And I know a lot about the Bible. Like, I know too much. I wish I didn't know as much as I do know. But yeah, it was this use of this passage in Romans. And here's how it goes. I'm giving you the paraphrase. God put us in charge. We made the laws, therefore they're God's laws, and to violate them is to violate God. Now, there are so many ironies in that. And it's a great example of how America has always used the Bible to justify its behavior. It has. One of the reasons why we can't just get rid of the Bible and say we're kind of beyond that is that it's deep, deep in our decisions, in our history, in our laws, and in our collective unconscious. It rests down in there, the stories, the images, and occasionally we snatch them up for our own purposes. You don't forget, though, that the guy who wrote that was killed by the Roman Empire for violating the laws of the Roman Empire. And now we say, can't violate our laws. Quoting him. That's what I mean. It's like, it's quite infuriating. I actually want to talk a bit about the Bible this morning. And another thing I thought of, which is, I'll tell you a story, okay? There's a story of a family. And this family, like a lot of families, was growing up underneath an oppressive regime. I know it's hard to imagine. Imagine growing up underneath an oppressive regime somewhere in the world. And this family was starting to get nervous about their safety because the king was very intolerant of any threat to his power. In fact, one day he issued an edict trying to suppress and kill any child who might come up and take his kingdom. So this family felt like they had to flee, which is what you do when home is like a shark and you flee. So this family fled. They fled this oppressive regime, and they had to go through the desert to do so. And they made the long trek through the desert, and they got to the border of another country. So they're leaving one country, oppressive regime, and they got to the border of this country, and the border of this country was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire said, come on in. And they had some measure of safety until the king in the country they just left died, and they were able to go back home. You know what that story is? Freaking Christmas! That's the story. That's Mary and Joseph and Herod fleeing for their lives. Funny, ironically, they flee to the Roman Empire, which it was more open to these immigrants and their baby than the kingdom they just left. That's what I'm saying. And we call ourselves a Christian nation. I mean, it's like... So Mary and Joseph come to the border of Texas. We'll put Jesus among, I turned on CNN, 2,053 kids. We'll throw Jesus in there too, That's why, by the way, Jesus grows up and says things like, whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. He's oriented toward the bottom of society, toward the marginalized. And you think, how did he get there? Look at his own story. Look how he grew up. Look at the stories, the family lore about being a bastard kid, basically. People didn't actually think he was born of a virgin. They were like, oh, that makes sense. They thought he was a bastard. That's what they would have called him. So anyway, side note. So I want to talk a little bit about the Bible, and I want to talk about what I'm going to call the prophetic imagination. So, some observations. The Bible can be used to justify all kinds of suffering. In our country, it's been used to justify slavery, patriarchal laws. It's been used to justify ethnic cleansing. All these are in our history, and it's been used to justify manifest destiny. We called ourselves the New Israel at one time, the New Jerusalem, all using the Bible to justify coming into this place. In fact, I read in this book that David Dean gave me. Of course, he gave me a book. I need to give it back to you. But there was a claim when America was first being settled that Georgia was on the same latitude as the Garden of Eden, and they thought they had found it. So therefore, let's come on over to the Garden of Eden, which that's advertising, I guess. But interestingly enough, the same book has been used for the Civil Rights Movement. Same book. Martin Luther King Jr. was deeply influenced by the prophets of the same book that I'm talking about. So sometimes it's used for liberation, and sometimes it's used for oppression, which is very interesting. And let me say something else about sort of the Bible right now, sort of being a weapon in the hand. They're in the hands of the powerful. there's a sort of story hidden in plain sight in the Torah. And it goes something like this. The Jewish people are slaves in an oppressive empire and regime called Egypt. There's a kind of liberation story, that's Moses. They go into the desert. Then they begin to settle in the promised land, and they start to turn toward conquest and eventually toward empire until they become oppressors. It seems to be a cycle, and it's right there in the Bible, and the Bible doesn't cover it up. That's one of the reasons what makes it so amazing. You'd think it would cover up its own grievances, but it doesn't. It exposes them. So by the time you go from Moses to Solomon, all of the ironies are quite present. And Solomon is the one who ends up enslaving his own people to build his own palace. And as soon as he dies, the empire splits and then begins to dissolve even more after that until it falls apart. There's a kind of pattern or cycle here from being oppressed to being the oppressor, which should cause a little warning lights to go off. This is what happens. It's part of, in some ways you could say it's part of human nature, but it's not inevitable. And in the biblical tradition, the voices that come along are called the prophets, that start to change or point out the ironies and inconsistencies. They're the ones that stand on the street corners and say, look at how you're behaving. They're the ones that say things like, do not oppress the alien, the foreigner, the widow. You were once oppressed yourselves. How dare you turn around and do this? So that's the prophet, the prophetic imagination. And think about the courage that took, and some of them were killed. It's not like Twitter, where you can say whatever you want with no consequences. You know, it was much more serious than that. And let's see how much time I have. Something in 1976, a scholar named Golub, great name for a scholar, published his findings around cycles of empires. And he makes a claim that empires tend to go in 250-year cycles. And Margaret Wheatley is the one who popularizes his stuff. And I want to read to you the cycles in case any of this rings true. He said, number one, you have an era of pioneers. Okay, pioneers come and it's very community-oriented, and they try to eke out an existence, a very communal existence. But once that pioneer sort of phase has ended, it shifts into an age of conquest. Because one of the things the pioneers figure out is it's hard to be pioneers. So if we banded together and got rid of people who are trying to oppress our pioneering, we'd be more free. That turns into a time of commerce. So from being a pioneer to conquest to commerce. Once the enemy has been vanquished enough, all of a sudden we have access to all of their resources, and there's a lot of trade and commerce happening, which leads to the next period, which is affluence. Suddenly, pioneers who had almost nothing, a couple generations, their great-grandkids have enormous affluence and don't even know what to do with it. I know this is really hard to imagine that this might happen. By the way, his research goes all the way back to the oldest records we have in China. He's not describing America. He's trying to say, this is the cycles of empires. So, after the age of affluence, it turns to the age of intellect. That once people have abundance, they begin to invent, be creative, study art, science, politics, lots of intellectual activity. Think about the Greeks or the Romans, which is followed by the final phase of this cycle, which is the age of decadence. And I'll describe to you what he says it looks like. The concerns are petty in the age of decadence. They're overwhelmed with a sense of narcissism. Me, I did it my way. It tends to be consumeristic. Becomes the value system, materialism, fundamentalism. This is all how he describes the age of decadence. fundamentalism, an abandoning of morals. And here are the three. I mentioned this once before in a talk I did here like 6 months ago, but this is worth repeating. He says, during this time period, the age of decadence, they worship three figures: athletes, actors, and musicians. Yeah. And we've elected one as president. I'm serious. A television star. I mean, sorry, I automatically jumped to, does this apply? By the way, Margaret Wheatley, very sort of almost cynically, although cynicism isn't, I think it's more maybe an arrow of the prophetic imagination, says that Obama spent a lot of time giving medals to musicians. Those are our heroes. Now, the scary thing about this cycle is that once you're in the age of decadence, it falls apart and the empire collapses. And nobody gets out of it, says Glubb. Nobody. Oh, except Americans, of course. That's what the Romans said. No, we'll be fine. Look at all the empires that have come before us. They've all collapsed, we won't. That's what we say. Now, I'm not arguing for this and saying, hey, let's band together and become anarchists and help the empire collapse. I'm saying this is just a pattern, but one of the things I think is interesting about the Bible, which also fits into this same pattern, is something in the consciousness emerges during the age of decadence that I'm calling the prophetic imagination. The prophets stand up and say, it doesn't have to be this way. They stand up in the middle of all the tension and start, what we would say, speaking truth to power and to the systems, the power systems. And they do it in very dramatic ways, which some of them I'll come to in a couple minutes. So, I'll give you an example. Here's a line from the prophets. The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Okay? Our fathers, mostly fathers, by the way, have eaten something sour and we're pissed. That's a line from the prophets. The Bible, not only in the prophets, but sometimes in what we would call the law, I added it up. Well, I didn't do it. I used the World Wide Web. 14 times there's the line, do not mistreat the alien and the foreigner. That's the prophetic imagination, saying, don't turn around and become the oppressor. 14 times. Why didn't Jeff Sessions just say that? Hey, don't oppress the alien and the foreigner. Sorry. Don't oppress the alien and the foreigner. So, this is the awakening of the prophetic consciousness that exists in the middle of the mess. So I want to talk about what I'm going to say are 4 patterns. I'll go through them quickly. But 4 patterns of the prophetic imagination. And it's not necessarily biblical. I'm trying to think more broadly than that. I'm just going to say here are some elements. So first of all, the prophet has an experience of the divine. Okay? Contact with the divine. Now, if you're not particularly religious or spiritual, or maybe you don't, you don't believe in God as like a being up there or something like that, fine. You can also say it this way by saying that the prophet has an experience of his or her own ground that is deeper than social context. That's what I mean by contact with the divine. I have a sense, we would call it a sense of grounding. Being grounded in something larger, an experience of that, so the whims of culture and identity and social status don't matter. And what happens when you touch upon that ground is you're invincible to the culture. Nothing. You can say and do whatever you want because you've touched upon something that grounds you, that's much deeper than where do I fit in, what kind of clothes do I wear, how much money do I have, what is my status. Does that make sense? So the prophetic imagination is grounded, so to speak, in a kind of experience of something deeper. Here's the second point. They point out the inconsistencies and ambiguities of being a human. And they include themselves in the critique. Great example is if you look at the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah has an experience of the divine, or some rooting or grounding experience, and he says, I am a person of unclean lips. Isn't that an interesting response? Instead of like, man, I am freaking awesome right now. I am on fire. He says, I have unclean lips. He sees his own shadow side. So someone who has a kind of prophetic imagination is not on their high horse. They see, actually, it lives in me. It does. The same capacity for darkness lives in me. That's a prophet. I have unclean lips. Sometimes I don't say nice things or behave in ways that I promote on my Facebook page. Okay? So, in other words, it's in me too. That's what the prophet says. Which, by the way, creates a much more empathetic channel. Rather than, as you well know, when you're on your moral high horse, does anyone listen to you? All right. Number 3, this is their full-time job. They just simply call out BS. It's their full-time job. They're not predicting the future. They're actually using the future to threaten the present. They're saying, if you don't change your ways, you're going to burn up, basically. It's like a consistent prophetic message. But what they're doing is calling out the BS in the culture. And who are they focusing on? The political and religious establishment. They're not picking on the day laborer. They pick on the religious establishment and the political establishment, which in the ancient world was the same thing, which in the modern world is the same thing. That's right. By the way, thanks for bringing this up. So when the government of the United States takes an executive action, makes a law, and then uses the Bible to justify that, the definition of that is a theocracy. You know who else is interested in theocracy? ISIS. That's the premise of ISIS. It's a theocracy. Which would make sense why we would fight them. Our theocracy is better than your theocracy. You know? My button's bigger than your button. Or whatever. Okay, that was a bit of a dark side note there. But they call out the political and religious establishment. That is their full-time job, and they largely do it through public acts, public statements. And I don't mean like publishing a statement. Like Isaiah walked around naked for 3 years in Jerusalem and said, this is how you appear before God. Which is hilarious to me. That's in the Bible, you know? They're like, we should be more biblical. Well, which guy are we talking about here? Because, you know? But imagine, that would be like me walking around in D.C. saying the emperor has no clothes. Walking around naked in D.C. saying the emperor has no clothes. Now, I would be arrested. But I would also be telling the truth. I'm not planning on doing this, by the way, although the wheels are turning. Yeah, but that's, or Ezekiel does something awesome. He builds a model of Jerusalem in Jerusalem and then destroys the model. So that's a public act that points out the ironies, inconsistencies, and ambiguities of empire. And they're not well liked, these prophetic figures. They might, like in the United States, they might walk across a bridge while being hosed with water cannons. That's a public act. And part of the awakening of the prophetic imagination is actually to use your imagination for what is a public act. So that's their full-time job. No one gets a free pass from sort of the wheelhouse of the prophet. No king, no leader, no religious leader. Now here's the fourth point, and I'll try to bring it to a close here. The fourth point I'm actually getting from Abraham Heschel, who has a great book called the prophets. So if you're really interested in the relationship between the prophets and social justice, he's the man. Heschel is the man for this, who marched alongside Martin Luther King. And how did he get this idea? He read his Bible. Seriously. Anyway, he says the prophets do it with tears. They grieve the fact that they have to speak like this to power. And to me, that's such a powerful observation. And I think those of us who would like to see some changes in the United States, like all of us, I think this observation should shake us up a little bit. Say, what in this breaks my heart? Rather than, who can I blame and deride? I mean, it was so infuriating when, for a week and a half or so, Trump was blaming everybody but himself. Except I sometimes do the same thing. If I could just blame Trump, then I would feel better about myself. And that's what I think Heschel's pointing out here when he says the prophet does it with tears. It breaks their heart. What breaks their heart? The actual injustice itself, and also the fact that they have to speak like this to power in wherever they find themselves. So these four things, they have an experience or a ground that grounds them deeper than their social status, or an experience of the divine, I called it. They're able to point out inconsistencies and say, me too. Their full-time job is to call out BS, and they do so with tears. And what I'm suggesting is that this split between who we've said we are publicly and how we're actually living is now sort of coming up like a volcano, like Hawaii, and ruining homes. Something's coming up from the underside of our culture. And if that's the case, I think it's also, in terms of pattern, the case that we have to start asking, where's the prophetic imagination? Where's the prophetic imagination that's going to come right alongside these massive inconsistencies in who we say we are? And I don't know, that's, at least in my mind, when it starts to become more personal. In other words, I'm asking what prophetic emergence is happening right now. It could be in you. I actually think the prophet is an archetype. So there's something of the prophetic imagination that's in you. We don't have to say who is he or she, although that's a good idea. They might not have your same skin color, by the way, like that poem we read. So who is already speaking through actions and words in our culture that's challenging the political religious establishment, and also what's waking up within you. And the prophetic imagination is going to read and hear the world differently. It's going to hear something like, this is the land of the free, and also have the capacity to say, and we incarcerate more people per capita than any country on earth, more than Russia. Russia. Yeah, that place. Who, when they incarcerate people for being political dissidents, they're open about it. That's what we do. We lock them up. We still have more people in jail per capita. Land of the free. That's the prophetic imagination saying something is going on here. You know, that's when you hear things on the news that say, well, this is on Fox News, they're not our kids. Right away, I think you can also hear Jesus saying, whatever you do for the least of these. There it is, right there. That's the prophetic imagination. And in some senses, I think because so many people claim that this is a Christian nation, in a sense, the biblical prophetic images have to be brought to the surface right alongside, because you can't hold those two at the same time. In other words, the Bible that you cling to for your own unjust and fearful safety mechanisms is the very thing that can tear it apart. Yeah. I think next time we hear someone say, a God bless you, or God has blessed the USA, we also have to say, on the backs of who? Or whom? Not sure which is the right grammar. Who, thank you. Yeah. Okay. I kind of want to leave it at that. I just want to let that hang in the air. Let me end with this little excerpt, which I want to encourage you to read the entire poem called Home. It's quite powerful, and you can watch the whole thing being read on YouTube. I want to go home. But home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of a gun. And no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore. Unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, save, be hungry, beg, forget pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home unless home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here.